Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS. I want to welcome the audience in the room, and I want to welcome the audience virtually that's joining us for what's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm excited. I've been looking forward to this for weeks, and this is a chance to really have a conversation with somebody I've admired for many years. I met your uncle. Your uncle was famous ambassador.
Career foreign service officer.
Career ambassador,
Yes.
and I met him when I was in college. That was, 60 years ago. It's a long time back.
I describe him as the real ambassador, Sullivan. I'm the pretender.
But, and you've lived up to that Sullivan family reputation. You were a brilliant ambassador. You were a brilliant deputy secretary.
You're kind to say.
We're really grateful to have you here. This is a wonderful book. This is it's called Midnight in Moscow, and it is a memoir of your time in Moscow. By the way, it's also a love story because he conveys movingly, his love affair with his wife Grace, and the way that he got home just in time, one day before she passed. It's a love story too, but it's a dramatic story, John, and you title it Midnight in Moscow, and you begin your book on the 21st of February of 2022, the night before the invasion. Why that, and why the title?
Well, it was the defining feature of my tenure as ambassador, John. At first, let me say express my gratitude to you and for CSIS for having me here at this august forum to discuss my book. It defined my tenure as ambassador and changed history. I don't think that's an overstatement. And it ties into the title because, as you note, in the introduction to my book, I begin with a description of how I was advised that the war had started, that the so-called special military operation had started. We had a 24-hour watch at the embassy, and I went home to my residence, Spaso House, not on the embassy compound, and we had a code for the watchstander to call me to alert me that the war had started. There have never been secure communications at Spaso House, the residence. Yeah. So it was a code, and the call came just after midnight, as we expected in the middle of the night. That in fact, the tanks, troops, missiles, planes, drones had crossed the border, and the war had started. It was
one of the most dramatic times in our at least recent history.
Yeah.
And you recount it so brilliantly. What I'd like to do in our discussion, John, is to help the audience understand Putin and understand Russia. And I think there are just real stereotypes that we have here, and so you were closer to it. You saw them. You talked to him. Yeah. So who is Putin? What is Putin?
So I met with Putin, was in his presence a fair number of times, probably as often as any American government official in the last 10 years or so. The other thing that worked to my advantage in trying to learn Putin turned out to be the pandemic. I was stuck in Moscow, couldn't travel for 13 months, was a geographic bachelor, as you mentioned. My wife, Grace, and my family were here in D.C., so I had a lot of time in my hands. And I spent that time, much of it, in the station at the embassy, reading about this Russian leader, his government, and what they were about, being briefed by people across the IC and at the State Department on secure video conferences from Moscow, along with some of my colleagues. So I tried to learn as much as I could about the Russian leader, about Putin, Vladimir Vladimirovich, and I describe him in a chapter in my book.
The Chekist.
And the title of the chapter, is The Chekist, which is a reference to the Cheka, which was the original security service, the secret police established by Lenin at the start of, just after the start of the October Revolution, to protect and defend the revolution and defeat the class enemies that they were waging war against. And the Cheka, interestingly enough, was established by a Pole, Felix Dzerzhinsky, descended from Polish nobility, but he was charged by Lenin with establishing this secret police organization that was not bound by law, was not bound by God, because the communists didn't believe in God. There were no morals. The only charge, the only thing that bound them, Dzerzhinsky's group, was their commitment to the revolution and to protect the revolution, and in particular in the person of Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders. Putin descends from the Cheka. He self-describes as a Chekist. What's a Chekist? Cheka is a person who is a member of the Russian Secret Service. There are special services, they call it. It's now in the form of the FSB. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB split into a very large federal security service, the FSB, and a smaller foreign intelligence service, the SVR. There was also a separate military intelligence service, as you know well, the GRU. Putin calls himself a KGB man, and he famously has said, he sounds like somebody who was a member of an organized crime family here in the United States. He says there's no such thing as a KGB man. That's real. You have to understand where he comes from and his worldview, which is colored so much by his experience starting in the mid-70s, recruited, petitioning, applying to, desperate to join the KGB, and ultimately being accepted into its ranks, rising to the relatively modest rank of lieutenant colonel. The Cheka, and I'll conclude this little history diversion, the Cheka itself, the Chekists, ultimately traced their lineage back to Ivan the Terrible and the Oprichniki, who were the Tsar's basically bodyguards, again, not bound by law. Their only job was to protect the Tsar. And they were famous for wearing long black leather tunics, which is why the Chekists, the original Chekists, and this continues to this day with the FSB, are famous or infamous for wearing long black leather coats.
So how, we were talking earlier, colleagues here, about how large the FSB is.
Right. The FSB is roughly 10 times the size of our FBI, for example. There are hundreds of thousands of FSB personnel. Just the counterintelligence section of the FSB that's dedicated to monitor the U.S. Embassy in Moscow is roughly 7,000 officers.
It's unbelievable, yeah. But if you set up a government, an authoritarian government that's all about control,
right,
you perceive enemies everywhere.
Absolutely.
And it just
enemies
manages.
Sometimes there are real enemies. More often than not, you need enemies.
Yeah, yeah.
And Putin needs enemies.
You said that, Putin only became lieutenant colonel, the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel. Do you think his lack of real success inside the KGB affects him emotionally?
Possibly. I mean, he is, as I've said now several times, I mean, he is to his core a KGB man. I might liken it to, and we talked about this earlier, if I could use a baseball analogy. The pretty good baseball player who makes the major league roster and maybe is a substitute player, not a regular, not an all-star, but dedicates his life to the game, and after he retires becomes a coach and a manager and a TV commentator, but is all about baseball. I think of, from my youth, someone like Don Zimmer, who was once manager of the Red Sox, for any of my fellow Boston Red Sox fans out there, or Terry Francona, old-fashioned baseball guys who weren't necessarily all-stars or even regulars. That's Putin. That's his whole life. is cagey. It colors his view of the world and of Russia.
Yeah. John, let me shift to what you relay in the book about the start of the war, and you argue that one of the big factors was the way we pulled out of Afghanistan, that it communicated to Russians that we didn't have the will to stay through something tough. Now, I would argue it's not just Afghanistan. I think you look what we did in Georgia. We said we were going to bring him into NATO, and then we waffled on it. We waffled on Crimea. But share with us, how do you feel that these things affected?
So I think
Russia?
in this context, it would be an overstatement to say Afghanistan wasn't the moment when Putin said, "Aha, I can get away with this. I'm going to invade Ukraine." It was confirmation of a view that he already had about the United States. First of all, he has contempt for the United States. I think he has contempt for Biden. I think he exhibited that. He's taunted Biden subtly. Afghanistan figures in this only in the sense that, as I write in the book, Putin and Biden meet for a summit in mid-June. I think it was June 16th in 2021. By that point, looking back, as I look back, I'm convinced that Putin had decided to invade Ukraine. He was going to accomplish his objectives for Ukraine, which were to, as he stated consistently, since the war started, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Why do I say that? And I lay this out in the book. What did Putin and Biden talk about most in Afghanistan? I'll tell you what they didn't talk about: Ukraine. They talked about the Arctic. They talked about Afghanistan. Biden raised our, at that point, looking for a counterterrorism base in Central Asia because he told Putin that he was going to, as the president then put it, responsibly end our engagement in Afghanistan after 20 years. Putin then taunted Biden, subtle. Putin said, "Oh, you want a counter? Okay, well, we'll let you share our 201st base in Tajikistan, which is on the border with Afghanistan." Oh, okay, that sounds plausible. Except he had no intention of sharing that space. That base with the United States, how do I know that? Sitting across from me, as protocol would dictate, I was on the far end of the table. Across from me, Putin had brought with him the chief of his general staff, Colonel General Gerasimov. And I'm looking at Gerasimov. As soon as Putin said that, his eyes went, and he sat back, and I'd like, this was unscripted, and kind of a taunt, right? Yeah, you can share our base. Yeah, go. Don't count on it, buddy. He was very relaxed. He was cracking jokes to Putin, not necessarily to Biden, excuse me, but I was as I look back, the fact that he didn't raise in a pronounced way, there was, fleeting references to the Minsk agreements and Ukraine and settling this problem. But they discussed a lot of issues: cyber attacks in the United States, election interference, wrongfully. You go down the list. When President Biden had his press conference after the summit meeting, I think he listed 11 or 12 things that he and Putin discussed. And the second to last thing he listed was a sentence, he said it in a sentence fragment discussing Ukraine. Why is that significant? Months later, Ukraine was an existential problem for Russia. Putin was ranting that Russia needed security guarantees from the United States, from NATO, focused on Ukraine, because that was what was happening in Ukraine, sponsored, as Putin would say, by the United States and its vassals, his word, in NATO, was an existential threat to Russia. And there needed to be immediate diplomacy. Treaties needed to be drafted. He charged the MFA with doing that. There was an immediate crisis in November of 2021. What happened between June 16th and November that would have caused Putin's view to change? Nothing. He was planning to do this. My view is Afghanistan just confirmed for him that the United States is just is weak and won't oppose me in a way that will cause real damage to Russia if I do what I need to do to reestablish my vision of the Russian Empire and the Ruski Mir, the Russian world.
Yeah. I know that you haven't been back, since you flew here urgently to be with Grace.
I can't because I've since been sanctioned.
You've been sanctioned?
I can't
oh,
go
my
back.
goodness.
I could go back if I wanted to be a guest in a labor camp.
I'd so love to be sanctioned. I think that would be great. But just how do you think Putin and the people around him view what's happened during these last 2.5 years?
Yeah.
I mean, 500,000 casualties.
Sure.
Finland, Sweden joining NATO.
Sure.
Probably $200 billion given by NATO countries and us to Ukraine. How do you think he views that?
Well, he has admitted, and this comes from the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, came to Moscow, met with Putin some weeks after the war, although I'd be arrested if I said that in Russia, because it's not a war, it's a special military operation. The special military operation began. Bennett later recounted that Putin said to him, yeah, boy, we weren't as good as we thought we were, our military. We weren't as ready as I thought we were. And boy, the Ukrainians were a lot tougher than we thought they were. And I explain in the book why I think we've rightfully, understandably, I should say, focused on the failures of the Russian military, and there have been some pretty dramatic ones. I think it is actually the failure, the greater failure is the failure of the FSB, but I'm diverging from the topic. I explain that in the book. But having said all that, 300,000, 500,000 casualties. From Putin's perspective, his view is, imagine the millions that we sacrificed to liberate Ukraine, to liberate that part of Russia from the Nazis. This is nothing. The limitation that he has on him, on his ability, is the support of the Russian people. And so far...
What do you think?
So he won re-election in March of this year with, I believe the figure was 87.3% of the vote. If we imagine hypothetically a free and fair democratic election, which did not happen in March, he wouldn't get 87.3% of the vote, but I bet he'd get a majority. He'd win. He can't risk losing, which is why he has to fix the election. And it was interesting to me to see how high the winning percentage was. I say in the book, and I wrote this part of the book before the election, that it had been, in the past, his sweet zone for percentage margin of victory was to get about 75, 76, 77% of the vote. Too much, 98% of the vote, and it's hard to defend as a free and fair election. 87% was higher than I thought that in their managed democracy, their expression, that they managed to turn out an 87.3% victory. Look, Russians are patriots. Russians, and I write about this in the book, and you and I have talked about this. The important threads of Russian history, not Soviet history, Russian history, the history of the Russian Empire, predating the Russian Empire, the insecurity that Russians feel, particularly in European Russians, from threats from both the West and the East. Their insecurities are real, and Putin plays on that. I said before that he needs enemies. He's got a useful enemy from his perspective in the United States. We are the enemy. That's his phrase. My colleagues at the State Department, we come up with all sorts of different words other than saying enemy, competitor. If things are really bad, adversary. For a Chekist, we're the enemy and have been from his perspective. So Russians, the average Russian is a Russian patriot. He doesn't want to see, they call them their boys. They don't want to see their boys in Ukraine lose. Once committed, they don't want to lose this war, particularly a war that Putin has convinced them the United States started against Russia. But there are limits There are limits, I believe, John. Same Russian people, they don't want to see their boys zip tying the hands of elderly men and women behind their backs and shooting them in the back of the head, or intentionally targeting a civilian train station where there are no military trains or targets with anti-personnel weapons, missiles, and killing hundreds of people intentionally. The Russian people wouldn't like that, which is why Putin's sensitive to accusations of war crimes, for example. He doesn't care about the ICC, the International Criminal Court. He's concerned about war crimes, though, which is why they resist so furiously any accusation, because he doesn't want to lose that support that he needs. So, yeah, the war is, I won't say it's wildly popular, but it's still supported. And if the alternative is a defeat, a large majority of the Russian people don't want to see that. Just as for those of us in this room who, like you and me, who are old enough to remember our commitment in Vietnam, the average American, until well into the war, didn't want to see the U.S. defeated in Vietnam. I happen to have, you mentioned my Uncle Bill, who was a career Foreign Service officer, served at the embassy in Saigon, was our ambassador in Vientiane, Laos. I had a cousin, and that's my father's side of the family. My mother's side of the family, I had a Marine, my cousin Joseph, a Marine in the 1st Marine Division in Way City during the Tet Offensive. I remember as a kid, we didn't want to see the United States lose in Vietnam. It took a long time, years, for the tide to turn with the election of Nixon and Vietnamization and so forth. It would take a lot to turn Russia now against Russians and Russia against this war that Putin started in Ukraine.
So you, about halfway through the book, you talk about sanctions.
Yeah.
What do you think of sanctions? Do you think they've had any impact, or are they something we should do?
Sure, they had impact, absolutely. But I write in the book, I went with Ambassador Burns, Director Burns, in the beginning of November of 2021, when it became clear to the United States government that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. The president sent Bill Burns to meet with Russian leaders, including Putin, in Moscow. I happened to be home on leave then, and my vacation with my wife got canceled, so I could go with Director Burns back to Moscow. But Bill, with Putin, with Patrushev, who was then the Secretary of the Security Council, told them in no uncertain terms, on behalf of the President of the United States, we see what you're going to do. The response from the West is going to be catastrophic for Russia. Don't do it. The Russian response, the consistent response from Putin through Patrushev, Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, Bill met with him, Narishkin, the head of the SVR, they knew why Bill was coming. So their message was rehearsed, but it was genuine. And I characterize it in the book as confidence bordering on arrogance. The basic message was, yeah, economic sanctions hurt. The Russian Federation today isn't the Soviet Union, the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was, 350 million people. And economic sanctions hurt. Yeah, you've got an enormous economy, good for you. But boy, our military is back. In fact, our military is as strong, maybe stronger in certain areas than the U.S. military. We've invested a lot of money. Now, we're not going to invade Ukraine. Don't get me wrong. This is, that's just not going to happen. But if there's trouble in our neighborhood, we can take care of it. So no need to trouble yourselves. And that's what Bill reported to the president. I don't think flying back on the plane with him and talking about this, I mean, we couldn't say, I don't think anyone who had seen that reaction thought, that he had definitely decided to do it, such that we could say definitively advising the President of the United States on such an important topic. 100% certain Putin's going to do it. But boy, the message that we brought back was, it's close. We believe he's going to do it. We don't think he's made the final decision, but we got to be prepared because we think it's coming. If you track what's going on now, the Russian economy is having some real issues.
Absolutely. I mean, the discount rate for their equivalent of the Fed is 18%. Inflation is running over 10% now.
Absolutely. Inflation is a scourge for them. It's a real problem.
It's hurting. Now,
yes.
But will it hurt enough to make a change? Do you think?
So a couple of things on that point. I met with, early on in my tenure, the governor of the Central Bank of Russia, who is an extremely talented,
woman.
highly respected in international financial circles. Putin made an interesting statement not long after the war started to a Russian audience, a Russian state media interview. He was asked, Mr. President, why now? Why didn't we invade Ukraine sooner? And his immediate response was, we weren't ready. Now, people thought he meant militarily. I think it wasn't just militarily. He needed to reestablish, in some ways, the sources of technology and equipment that the Soviet Union, in a regime where the West had shunned Soviet communism. I think he had to do his best to prepare for the worst that the West could do with sanctions and export controls, important for the chips, weapons themselves, drones. So yeah, the Russian economy has definitely taken a hit, which is why what he's done is so tragic. The cost that it's imposed on the Russian people, but the bigger tragedy is what he's done to Ukraine. In the Ukrainian, 15 million people killed, wounded, internally displaced, or forced to flee their country and are now refugees because of a decision by one man that he was going to reestablish this empire that is so important to him.
It was evil. There's no question of it. When I finished reading your book, and I was struck by, and this was a book I read when you were stuck in Moscow. I was stuck in my little apartment and read this remarkable book called Journey for Our Time. And this is it is a travelogue and a commentary by a mid-level, I don't know if he was mid-level or not, aristocrat in France. I mean, they have, and I don't know much about aristocracies, but they've got some talls and they've got some grandes and they've got some ventis, and I think he was between a tall and a grande,
Well, as I point out, as a Bostonian, I don't drink Starbucks. I'm a Dunkin' guy.
You're a Dunkin' guy.
Small, medium, large, and extra large.
Well, he was between a small and a medium, I think, as an aristocrat, but a brilliant intellectual. And this was a trip he took back in 1838, 39, and wrote this in 1840. And I was just startled by how similar things sounded. And so what I'd like to explore with you now is this Putin? Is this Russia? Did Russia make Putin? Did Putin warp Russia? And just kind of go through a few things. Towards the end of the book, he writes, he says, Russia sees Europe as a prey which our dissensions will sooner or later deliver up to her. She foments anarchy among us in the hope of profiting by a corruption she promotes because it is favorable to her views. Let's see, he goes on. For many years, Paris read revolutionary papers, revolutionary in every sense, paid for by Russia. Europe, they say in Petersburg, is taking the line that Poland followed. She will enervate herself through vain liberalism, which we remain powerfully precise, while we remain powerful precisely because we are not free. Let us be patient under the yoke. We will make others pay for our shame. This sounds an awful lot like Putin today.
Yeah.
But this is 180 years earlier.
Yeah.
Is this Russia?
Well, I mean, first of all, my first reaction is it sounds at approximately the same time, Tocqueville in the United States, right, with a different perspective on a different country. But this is shot through Russian history. I mean, if you could change the lingo, right, you'd say the same thing about the Soviet Union, about the West and the decadent, with the dialectic that they expected for Western capitalism to collapse. But what interests me, John, about this is the obsession, the focus on the West. And maybe if I turn this a little bit, because Putin is now, with all those criticisms that you've just read from almost 2 centuries ago, very similar view from Putin now. His reaction, though, is because of the U.S. and our vassals' war against Russia, he wants to reorient Russia east and south. Mm-hmm. And that's not the Russian perspective. I mean, it's from Peter the Great through to the present day. I've yet to meet a wealthy Russian who said to me, my lifelong desire is a townhouse in Shanghai, mm-hmm. or a flat in Beijing. Oh, they want to go to London, West Palm Beach, Park Avenue, Beverly Hills. It's Western, it's not Eastern.
It's been this, yeah.
But Putin himself plays on this, right? He likes to say to visiting leaders, particularly from the West, you look at me and you think I'm like you, but I'm not. I've also got this Eastern heritage. I'm a different kind of cat. Mm-hmm. I'm a Eurasian. I'm different. So, he's trying to, with his engagement with the PRC, with Iran, both because of necessity, but also because of their shared views on what, and it's a phrase I don't like, the rules-based international order, which is, the talking point that I would be drafted by public affairs that I'd have to use. But our system, what we've developed, after the Second World War, he and Xi and the mullahs in Tehran are looking to smash that and are making some progress in it. But his relationship with Xi is problematic, and problematic for Russians, and Russians recognize this. I'm sure Putin does as well. Someone, a Russian once said to me, Putin sitting at a table with Xi or sitting at a dinner table with Xi, he looks at Xi and sees an ally, somebody who's going to support him, give him weapons and so forth. And what does Xi see when he looks across the table at Putin? A peasant who sells him gas.
Do you think that? How do you think Russians feel about that? I mean, it must bother them deeply that they've become so dependent economically on China.
Yeah, well, and militarily. I mean, we've seen more statements by, Deputy Secretary Campbell, Jake Sullivan, providing more detail on the support that the PRC is providing to Russia, and of course the Russian relationship with Tehran, and we can't forget what President Trump called Little Rocket Man in Pyongyang. Yeah. I used to call them, when I was Deputy Secretary, the Crinks: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So Putin's going to have to do what he's got to do. I mean, Stalin during the war was ultimately relying on the West, Lend-Lease, the United States, but ultimately in his appeals to the Russian people, in their righteous anger to resist the Nazi invaders from the West, calls upon their religious heritage, which is anathema to any communist. But, in the state of war like that, a leader, whether it's Stalin or Putin, has got to do what he's got to do, and Putin is going to.
He's doing what he's got to do.
He will never compromise. There is no negotiation with him over Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They've said this. The territory that they've conquered in Ukraine is not up for negotiation. And you know what's interesting, John? And this happened just as just after I'd arrived as ambassador. Putin, the Russians amended their constitution. And we focused on the amendment to the term limits provision, which everyone focused on, which allowed Putin to serve 2 more 6-year terms, and he was reelected in March. But there was a provision that I noted at the time, and I noted back to Washington, a provision in the Constitution that made it unconstitutional for any Russian leader, the Russian government, to alienate, to give to another country any portion of Russia's territory. Putin claims 4 oblasts in Ukraine are now Russian territory. And it's unconstitutional for him to give any of that territory back to Ukraine.
I want to come back to this.
By the way,
forward.
I used to tease my Russian interlocutors about this. I said, well, gee, I'm glad Secretary Seward didn't confront that position when we took Alaska off your hands. Thanks for that, by the way, guys. They didn't like me very much.
I want to come back to that very issue. But again, if I go back to the Marquis here, he wrote, "I do not know whether it is the character of the Russian nation which has formed such autocrats, or whether the autocrats themselves have given this character to the nation."
Right.
What do you think?
Well, first, let me note, Kennan makes very similar observations in the 40s, right, in his famous long telegram and the article he wrote anonymously as X on the sources of Soviet conduct. And it's an interplay of this long-standing, centuries-long feelings of insecurity, threats from East and West, and also it's really a lack of confidence, an inferiority complex principally with the West, that they're ahead of us. We've got to catch up. And Peter the Great, who turns through the establishment of St. Petersburg, focused on Europe and the West, his travels across Europe. Russia's always trying to catch up. And it's a sense of insecurity, and it's deep in the Russian psyche. Now, leaders, whether it's Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Putin, use that to maintain or expand what they have of Russia. For the communist leaders, the Soviet Union, they were willing, dominate the Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe, but with the ideological motivation they had, willing to wait to see the capitalist economies ultimately collapse. Not quite as aggressive as Putin's Russian Federation is now, but of course Putin is starting with a much smaller state. He doesn't have, as Patrushev said to me, we don't have 15 republics and 350 million people anymore. So Putin is reestablishing this Ruski Mir, this Russian empire, and that's really at his core. Lavrov, the foreign minister, is joked. This may be apocryphal, I don't know, but I believe there's a kernel of truth to it. When asked, and people always want to know, it's like the old Kremlinology from communist days, who are Putin's closest advisors? And Lavrov once quipped, he has three: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. And there's some truth to that.
Let me ask another part of the Marquis's commentary here, but I think it's somewhat relevant. He says, "In our time, the Russian people is the firmest in religious belief of all the Christian peoples. You have just seen the principal cause of the negligible efficacy of its faith. When the church abdicates freedom, it loses moral potentiality. The slave gives birth only to slavery." I've watched a bit the narrative coming out of the Patriarch Kirill. It's shocking.
Yeah.
The church seems to be fully a tool of the government, and this was again the case in Tsarist Russia. Did you interact with the Orthodox Church?
I didn't meet with the Patriarch himself, but I met with his number 2 Metropolitan Hilarion in Moscow, and it is. I used to say, when trying to give people in the West an understanding of Putin and how he uses Russia, Russian institutions, and the Russian people to his ends, to achieve his goals, I'd say there's nothing sacred in Russia, and I meant that literally. Obviously, it should be no big surprise to anyone that Aeroflot is an instrument of the FSB. That's a fact. Unfortunately, the Russian Orthodox Church is an instrument of the Kremlin, and to a certain extent, the FSB. And it does that in a number of ways. First, it is, in some cases, literally instrumentalized by officers of the FSB, but more so, it's Putin's narrative. Putin's narrative as a Russian nationalist, what Russians stand for. And again, it harkens back to this journey for our time from 180 years ago. It's still relevant to our time today because Putin is saying the West is decadent, it's in a death spiral down, whether it's LGBTQ rights, it's decadent society, they're undisciplined, they are on the road to perdition. And that's wrapped up in his religious views. Some of the Russians around him, like Patrushev, may in fact be devotees committed to the faith itself, the Russian Orthodox faith. Who am I, as to quote Pope Francis, who am I to judge? I don't know that Putin himself really believes it, divorced President Putin with his girlfriends. But put that to one side. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that he believes the Russian Orthodox Church has to espouse Russian policy, which he sets, which the Kremlin sets, because the Russian government supports, maintains, defends the Russian Orthodox Church, and the price for that is they have to do what Putin wants.
But they brought their astounding moral credibility with Russian citizens to the service then of Putin,
of course,
and his
yes.
agenda.
Well, as I said, in World War, when in the darkest days of Barbarossa, after the Germans had invaded, Stalin had to resort to urging the Russian people on with their great religious heritage to resist the invasion of the Nazis because it would crush their Orthodox faith, which the communists had tried to do themselves. But again, putting in service of the state, the Russian Orthodox Church, that's a tool that Russian leaders have used in the past, and Putin is unfortunately using that today. We see that in Ukraine with the schism between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church.
Well, I tell you, reading your excellent book and this, it just was like it was a time warp, you know.
Well, John, what's interesting is I've devoted a lot of time, both as ambassador, because as I said before, with the pandemic, I had some time on my hands, in addition to being holed up in the station and reading all that the best and the brightest in the U.S. government can say on Vova, on Vladimir Vladimirovich. I obsessed about Kennan and his writings. The ambassador's conference room attached to my office is the Kennan, my former office, the Kennan conference room. And it's just remarkable, the things that he wrote in 46, 47, 48. Well, no. He referred interchangeably, by the way, to Russians and Soviets, Russia and the Soviet Union. It was very interesting to me. He said the Russians and that Russian heritage, that Russian nationalism really dominated in Moscow. But the things he said about Stalin and the Soviet Union, you changed the names to Putin and the Russian Federation, and I point out several examples in the book where, boy, it's as true today as it was 80 years ago.
Yeah. Let's go back to the very chilling remark you made that Putin will never give up the territories he's occupied.
Right.
So how does this war end?
So, I urge in the book, at the end of the book, after describing my experiences in Moscow as ambassador through the war, through the first 6 or 7 months of the war, when I left Moscow in September of 22 and retired the next month, it is vital to the national security interests of the United States and our NATO allies and the world and those who believe in the UN Charter that Putin not prevail in Ukraine. When the rules-based international order worked the way it was supposed to, in 1990, when another global leader decided with grievances, Putin's got grievances, some of them legitimate grievances. Saddam had grievances too against Kuwait, shared oil field with Kuwait, but he claimed Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province and invaded, sacked Kuwait City. And the rules-based international order back then, we all think of President George Bush, 41, assembling the coalition, 37 countries, 500,000 U.S. troops in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, to defend the kingdom. All authorized by the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council passed multiple resolutions authorizing the use of force to expel Iraq from Kuwait. The Soviet Union voted in favor. The PRC abstained. The rules-based international order worked back then. Won't work now, at least through the United Nations. My policy prescription, and I didn't have enough space in the book to spell it out in more detail, nor do we have enough time here for me to fully explicate it, but let me summarize it this way. Kennan is famous, in his writings after the Second World War, is famous for providing the inspiration for the U.S. containment strategy with respect to the Soviet Union. Kennan's original conception of what containment meant, I explain in the book. It changed over the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administrations. This is how Kennan described it, the civilizational struggle between the United States and the West and the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union needed to be confronted not exclusively or necessarily militarily, but culturally, politically, in every way we could to show that our system, our values, our principles were superior. And that ultimately, when confronted with that type of containment strategy, that the Soviet Union would collapse, and it did. Now, there were many things that happened in implementing that containment strategy, whether it was Vietnam, you name it. There was the risk of nuclear war. I believe that how this war ends, it will only end on terms that the West can live with if there is a Kennan-style containment resisting Russian military aggression in Ukraine and containment of Soviet aggression elsewhere. Kennan-style containment. If we fail to do so, imagine how Putin is going to react. Consider this, when Ukraine, the Ukrainians, led by Zelensky, successfully resisted that major onslaught by the special military operation, the thrust south from Belarus to Kyiv, the attempt to sack Kharkiv, capturing large parts of eastern Ukraine. When the Ukrainians push back, the Russians can't take Kyiv. They collapse in Kharkiv. The Ukrainians recapture Kherson. Do you know what the polls showed? Bipartisan consensus of fulsome support for Ukraine, 85% in the polls. When the going gets tough, when the Russians fight back, when the Ukrainians don't expel all of the Russians from all of the Ukrainian territory that they'd captured, waging an aggressive war, and I detail this in the book. It's a crime against peace. Those who started the German aggressive war against Poland, they hanged at Nuremberg. When the going gets tough, and we say, we can't afford it, it's not worth it. Why are we defending Ukraine's borders when we're not defending our border in the southwest? That completely misses the point. It's as bad as what's happened to Ukraine is, and I am, as is evident in all that I've said and I've written, a huge supporter of Ukraine and admirer of Zelensky and his government's historic resistance. The real interest of the United States is stopping Russian aggression. I would be making the same argument whether the country that had been invaded was Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, you name it. We can't let a permanent member of the UN Security Council with the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world fabricate a rationale for starting the largest war on the continent of Europe since the Second World War, doing what it's done to 15 million Ukrainians, as I said before, killed, wounded, eternally displaced, or refugees, and have them succeed. If we do, and we shift from when it looked like the Ukrainians were going to win, it's going to make what we did, as disgraceful as it was, as awful as it was, our withdrawal from Afghanistan is not, saying it will pale in comparison is a dramatic understatement. It will empower Putin. It will empower Xi. It will empower those who believe, as Putin does. We in the United States, politicians in the United States, we as Americans, if someone says, do you believe in endless wars? Hell no. Putin doesn't mind endless war.
You know, I had some trivial thing that I wanted to say to end this, but it would interrupt the grandeur of the statement you just made. Would you all say thank you to Secretary? It was really good. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.